I'm really, really happy to introduce a friend, Tila Mazel, who is a wonderful researcher and professor and writer. And Tila has a number of books, but the book she will be talking about has the absolute direct connection with our topic. That is Janusz portrait. And after I heard Tila and I read the book, and then she spoke at our portrait conference last year, I thought it would be absolutely so sad not to have her here. And she agreed to come. So, right from the ferry boat to you, please.
Oh, thank you so much. So what I'll do then is, I've got about 45 minutes, and then I'm happy to take some questions as well. I'm going to talk to you a little bit first about how it is that I got involved myself. I'll reciprocate the favor and give you a little bit of information about how I came to this story and my background. And then I'll focus the story on four people. I mean, I know you've learned a lot about Korczak, so I'm going to focus mostly on the story of Irena and how she connects to Korczak's story. The story of a woman who was, and this is a nod to Clea here, was a nurse, the chief nurse in the Warsaw Ghetto, who was a very good friend of hers and a collaborator, whose story is also a very important part of both Korczak's story and Irena's story. And then a little bit on the story of Stefa, who sometimes gets overshadowed, I think, by the, just the real sort of moral courage and charisma of Korczak, and her story is the other half of that partnership, but she was sometimes the more silent partner because she was not the public face of the partnership for many people. So my background is I started out as an English professor and as a historian. I mostly focus on Second World War history. Actually, my focus is primarily historically on the Second World War in France. So I began as a specialist of the Vichy period, working on what I call hidden histories, right? Thinking about the ways in which certain kinds of stories tend not to be told. And of course, if you know France in the Vichy period, you know that the research is extremely difficult and that all cultures have the topics that they struggle to speak of. And for the French, the Vichy period really is still that moment, right? It's a very, very difficult cultural topic for the French. So I began really focusing on that, on stories about things like the history of resistance networks led by employees working at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, which was occupied by the Germans as well as Paris, or women's biography more generally. I'm interested in that as a topic, thinking about the ways in which historically, just with the history of patriarchy, women's lives have tended to be less public, in some ways thinking ahead to Stefa, right, and to that story of how women's lives tend to be domestic and therefore kind of secret. So the way that my particular interest in this story began, I don't come from the Jewish community, don't have connections to the Jewish community. Really, it's my family's connection to Poland, and we're also not Polish. But so you're making the story less transparent for you by the minute, right? So my brother and sister-in-law used to work for the U.S. State Department. I'm a U.S. And Canadian binational, and so they worked in Poland. They were sent to work at the consulate. My brother was the visa office in Krakow. My sister-in-law ran the American school in Krakow. And they went to Poland as diplomats and fell in love with Poland. I had gone over when my niece and nephew were first born to see the new babies. And that was in the period right after Irena Sendler had just died, and which would have been in 2007. And her story was already pretty well known at that moment in Poland. She had, at the end of her life, become pretty well known in the country, although certain parts of that story are still to be told, I would say. Even having written the biography of Irena Sendler, I would say that the period after the Second World War is a story that someday somebody will need to write, but at this moment those Cold War archives are not accessible or reliable enough to tell that story. So it was really when I was there in Poland on that occasion that my sister-in-law said to me, hey, she knew I was looking for a new book topic. She knew that I work on hidden histories, especially women's lives. She said, have you heard this story about this woman named Irena Sendler? and I had not ever heard it. And so she told me the story, and I thought, you know, that's an amazing and important story of literally a hidden network, right? Because this was a resistance network, it had to stay hidden, because if it had been exposed, that would have risked both Irena and her collaborators and the children and the families involved. So that was really how I came to that story, is from that kind of academic background and interest in women's biography. And so what I discovered, I'll give you a quick just overview of what Irena Sendler's story is. Have any of you heard the story of Irena Sendler before? So there is a documentary, Mary Skinner. Yeah, I talked to her. And then there's a Hallmark. Yes, that's right. Yeah. That one's a little bit less reliable. Mary Skinner's documentary is very, very reliable. The Life in a Jar is another book you may have come across. That is, I think of that more as a kind of memoir of the school children involved, and did really important work early on in helping to popularize Irena's story, but I think the subsequent research has gone beyond that book at this point. So for those of you who haven't heard anything about Irena Sendler, the story is in the 1930s, Warsaw, right? Poland in the 1930s was an incredibly vibrant and really very progressive society. It was the moment where what we now think of as the modern welfare state in the kind of Canadian and European context was really being developed. It was being developed by a series of academics and practitioners, both pediatricians, nurses, lawyers, children's advocates of different kinds, and also people within the pedagogy departments, especially at the Polish Free University, but to some lesser extent at the University of Warsaw. And they were working together to try to solve problems of unemployment, child poverty, access to education. One of those professors was a very, very important woman named Helena Radlinska, who came from the Jewish community but really didn't really think of herself as Jewish, right? I mean, she had a Jewish family background but was not religious. One of those professors was Janusz Korczak, who of course you know about. And another one of the practitioners involved was Irena Sendler's father, who was a doctor and who was very involved in working especially with impoverished communities to make sure that there was access to health care. And very few doctors were willing to work with the Jewish community. He was one of those exceptions. So Irena Sendler, as a young girl in the 20s then, grows up with a father who is deeply committed to social advocacy and to social work, and has this really as a model before her. He ends up dying when she's a young child, largely as a result of exposure to epidemics. They think probably cholera or typhoid is what he died of. And at that moment, her mother is now a single mother and is quite financially strapped. At that moment, the Jewish community comes to her mother and offers to pay for Irena's education in recognition of her father's advocacy and support for the Jewish community. Her mother's a very proud woman and says, no thank you, I'll take care of my daughter myself. But Irena and her mother never forgot, right, that kind of tie between the Jewish community and her family. It also meant that Irena grew up very familiar with Jewish culture. And one of the things that really is important about that is that what all the evidence shows is that the people who helped in the Holocaust, the Poles who did help in the Holocaust, or the people in France who helped in the Holocaust, almost 2-1 were people who had some personal connection with some individual person from that community, right? So, one of the things that the research suggests is that why, as educators, we would want to have children in very diverse classrooms is that the things that prevent things like genocide are simply knowing people from the other community as an individual person. And so for Irena, she fits into that, very much into that demographic. So she grows up and she goes to the university. She decides that she wants to be an attorney and work in public advocacy. It's not a period in time, despite the kind of progressive nature of Poland in many other ways in the 1930s, where that's a real possibility for women. She's discouraged by the faculty from doing that. So she instead goes and becomes a teacher. She trains to become a teacher. She marries at this point a young man, a young Polish man named Mitek Sendler. That's the moment where She becomes Irena Sendler. When she graduates, two things have happened. One is that she's fallen in love with a young Jewish man who unfortunately is also married. His wife was a friend in one of her classes. So there's two very young couples. Neither of them have marriages that are working out. And Adam and Irena fall in love with each other. And she decides to go on and do graduate work. And at that moment, she does graduate work, moves over to the Polish Free University, and becomes a student of Helena Redlinska's, where Janusz Korczak is also one of the teachers on the faculty. So this is kind of the beginning of that kind of connection. But of course, when she goes there, her father is already known to all of these people, right? I mean, for her, this is more of a homecoming in a certain way than it is a kind of new beginning in that context. So she goes on to work with Helena Redlinska as a student, and she meets a group of women who become very, very important in the story that follows of what they do together in the Warsaw Ghetto. So you have to remember that by the 1930s, anti-Semitism is already not only significant in Poland, but is already being quite firmly legislated, right? I mean, there is something known as the bench ghetto, which is instituted in the 30s. One of Irena Sendler's first involvements as a social activist is in that context, where what the decree was is that Jewish students had to sit on a separate side of the auditorium in a university from what was called the Aryan students, right? So there was a ghetto of the seats, literally, in university settings. So she was very involved in the protests against that on campuses in that period. Got quite badly beaten up at one of them, quite famously. So she goes and she works then and meets these different friends. One of the friends is Alla Grinbergova, and Alla is a little bit older than she is. Alla is very, very tightly connected with Janusz Korczak already. So Korczak, because Alla is a bit older, and because she was understood as a nurse to be very, very talented with children, was somebody that Korczak was very drawn to. When he was doing radio programs, he would often put Alla on the radio as one of the experts in child pedagogy from the nurse's perspective, right? So she has kind of, because of those radio programs before the German occupation, she has this kind of aura among the other students and is known in a kind of semi-public way. And all of the other girls look up to her as really who they want to become. And Irena and Alla in particular become very, very good friends. But there are also a series of other women. One of them is a girl named Rachela Rosenthal. There's another one, another friend named Ava. Group of maybe a half dozen women, all of whom, Sophia is another one. There's a group of maybe a half dozen women who are very, very close friends. And are all Dr. Redlinska's students. So what happens, of course, is that the World War II begins. Ultimately, Poland falls and is occupied by the Germans. When the German occupation begins, the first law, the Resistance Act really begins as simply a kind of defiance of the Germans, right? It doesn't begin as an organized program. But the important thing is that you've got this group of women, all of whom are friends, long historical and in some cases family ties, who have been trained already as graduate students to have practice in social organization, right? Social and community organizing is the thing that they know how to do. And they have very, very similar values and philosophies about social justice. And so when the ghetto, before the ghetto was instituted, when the Germans occupied, the first rule is simply that Irena at this point is working in a social welfare office, and the rule is that Jewish people are no longer allowed to receive social welfare. And so Irena and her friends in the office decide that they are simply going to defy the German regulation. They're going to make sure that all of their clients get access to social welfare services. And so it really begins just as office welfare fraud is what they do, is they begin fiddling the files. So the Germans say that no Jewish person can receive aid, so they end up making up fake names for their clients that are sometimes hysterically and stereotypically Polish, apparently. They make up these family profiles, and then they assign to these families highly communicable diseases. that will prevent the Germans from wanting to follow up on home visits to find out, because the Germans were very afraid that they would catch typhoid or cholera, all of which they were allowing to run rampant in Poland as part of a kind of deliberate, I mean, it was really meant to be a deliberate public health crisis that they were trying to create. But they didn't want to catch their own public health crisis, so this was very effective at deterring people from checking up on these clients. And it really begins then for them as this act of political and patriotic resistance, right? That's how they end of a commitment to social justice. Well then, of course, what happens next is that the ghetto is instituted. Now you have to sort of imagine Irena Sendler's position. She's a woman in her late 20s. She has a Jewish boyfriend who she's been with for a number of years that she's very much in love with. He's in the ghetto. All of her girlfriends are now in the ghetto, and her boyfriend's wife is in the ghetto, right? And she very quickly decides that she's going to figure out how she's going to get into the ghetto to see her friends and her boyfriend. So she reaches out to a doctor who's already engaged in acts of resistance, who's connected with both Radlinska and with Korczak and who knew her father. And that doctor ends up giving her an epidemic control pass. And it basically says that she's one of the people who the Germans have allowed to go in to monitor the progress of the diseases in the ghetto and to report on those statistics. So she's now got a pass and she's allowed in and out of the ghetto on a daily basis. And so she does. She goes and she visits her friends, she visits Adam, and very quickly she witnesses what's happening in the ghetto, which is really a deliberate program of deprivation and starvation, right? Hoping that starvation and disease will solve a problem for the Germans that they haven't yet come up with a final solution for, as it were. And so she goes and she witnesses, and she's one of the few people, right, who really is witnessing this on a daily basis. And it begins with simply seeing that there are no vaccinations. So it starts out that she starts smuggling vaccinations into the ghetto and is smuggling also money into the ghetto so that on the black market people can buy food. And her girlfriends very quickly organize themselves into an organization within the ghetto to help especially children and especially orphaned children, because the most vulnerable populations inside the ghetto were not the Jews from Warsaw, right? I mean, although the conditions for those families were terrible, they at least had come from Warsaw with some kinds of resources available to them locally, and they typically had extended family networks because their families were from that area. But you have to remember that there were people who were Jewish families who were being sent from other areas where they were being displaced and asked to move into the Warsaw Ghetto, where space was already cramped and they had no connections, and they often arrived ill from having had to travel in difficult conditions for a long period, so that those adults tended to die at just a really terrifying rate early on, leaving orphaned children who had no family to care for them. And so the Radlinska's girls, basically, they set up this network to try to help those children. And many of those children are teenagers, right? Some of them are little children, but a lot of them are teenagers. And so a lot of the network becomes groups of 12, 13, 14-year-old children who are really helping littler children as part of what that organization is. They, of course, are immediately connected with Korczak, right, who is running the orphanage with Stefa in the ghetto. So they're working closely with Korczak, and also the files at the IPN, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Museum in Warsaw. What those files suggest is that Helena Radlinska, although she escapes the ghetto and is in hiding outside the ghetto, what those files suggest is that Helena Radlinska, who is hiding in one of the convents, is actually also running and organizing networks of cells, right? So we found the evidence that says that Irena Sendler was working in one of Helena Radlinska's cells. And we know that a number of other of the women who were involved with Irena kind of tangentially were part of these cells that were set up by Helena Radlinska to assist the children in the ghetto, right, and the Jewish community generally. And so the way it would work is Redlinska would reach out to one of her former students. We know that Irena at one point goes and visits Helena Redlinska in the convent. And we know that at that moment, essentially Redlinska is encouraging her students independently to set up resistance, ways to resist, right, and community activism. And we know that these people didn't typically know what the other person was doing, right? So that Irena would run into other former students of Redlinska's, and we know, for example, that her friend and colleague Sofia probably never told Irena that she was also running a separate cell, right? Sometimes they figured it out as things went along during the war, but in the beginning, the idea was not to let them know, because if you got arrested by the Gestapo, you couldn't tell what you didn't know, right? So Irena is at this point pulled in as well as the cell. So it begins then bringing things into the ghetto, attempting to smuggle supplies in. At this point, Alla is now the chief nurse in the ghetto and is one of the very, very important political figures and public health figures. And ultimately what happens as the conditions deteriorate further, Irena says, she tries to persuade her friends and Adam to flee and to go into hiding. And they refuse by and large. They say, we can't leave our community and our responsibilities. And so she says, the problem was that to go and visit her friends every day, they reached a point where you had to walk over the bodies of kids starving on the street. And she says that the first time they took a child out of the ghetto, it was just a spur-of-the-moment decision, right? That there's a kid, she's on her way out of the ghetto, she took the kid with her. And she said that was when she realized that it could be done. And so by the time you're into 1942, there's a decision, 41 even, decision to begin actively taking, at first it's street children, right? It's orphaned children out of the ghetto. So they're not taking children who have family care. These are the children who don't have any family or parents, who are living only in the orphanages or primarily really in the organization known as Centos, which has another care organization, began trying to get these children out of the ghetto and place them in either foster homes or in Catholic orphanages. And so they would begin smuggling those children out through quite elaborate and often quite controversial means. So in some cases, if a child could act well enough and were able to be courageous enough, you could teach a child to speak Polish, you could teach a child catechism, and the child could walk into one of the churches that had an entrance on the ghetto side and could pass the German test by reciting them, answering the right questions and reciting the catechism, and could walk out into onto what was then known as the Aryan side. So in some cases, that was one. In the case of one of the Holocaust survivors that I'd interviewed for the book, named Beata Fikowska, in Beata's case, she was a 6-month-old baby, and they put her in a toolbox, and they drugged her to go to sleep so she wouldn't cry, put her in the back of a truck underneath a pile of bricks, and drove her across the ghetto, out of the, past the checkpoint. In other cases, children went out through sewers. The sewer systems underneath the city, very often young teenage girls were the ones leading people through the sewers to escape. Another case was a boy who escaped by putting his shoes behind a man's boots, who had 2 big boots, and underneath his coat, and they walked across the checkpoint that way. So all of these ways of trying to smuggle children out of the ghetto and then place them either in foster homes or in orphanages, or in some cases in hiding, right? It was very, very difficult. One of the things that you'll notice is that the children who were saved were almost always under the age of 7 or 8. It was extremely difficult to save a child over the age of 7 or 8 because that's the age at which the native language acquisition begins to shut down, right? So many of the children, especially in the Orthodox community, did not speak Polish, and so had to be taught Polish without an accent. And unless a child could be taught to speak the language without an accent, the moment they spoke, it was a giveaway. It was also very difficult to save little Jewish boys. Most of the children saved happened to be girls, and that was because the boys were circumcised, right? And it was a very easy test for German soldiers to perform. So there were cases of the women in Irena's network running beauty salons. I met a man named Andreas Marianovsky, and he remembers his mother, who was one of Irena's friends and collaborators. His mother was the woman who ran the beauty salon, and the beauty salon was a place you took children, and if they were little Jewish boys, they were converted into little Catholic girls, right? And they would spend their time in the war basically disguising their gender. His mom was also the one who dyed the children's hair to turn brown hair blonde, right? So that these children could try to hide in sight was other part of it. So they begin getting the children out. One of the more famous stories, I mean, you probably know the story of Janusz Korczak and his walk to Treblinka. I imagine you've already heard that story. Irena was one of the people who witnessed that march through the ghetto that day. She was in the ghetto and was one of the people who saw that. And for her, there was a story behind that story that made that, she said to the end of her life that was the worst thing that she ever witnessed, right? She said at that moment, I don't know how our hearts didn't break. But for her, what had happened is that those children had already been children that Irena and her friends had helped to save once, right? So what had happened was that the other thing that their network was doing is that the Germans at one point would order roundups of street children who were living on the so-called, and again, forgive me, the Aryan side of Warsaw. One day they had a roundup and they rounded up 33 children. Well, they rounded up more children than that, 33 of whom were identified as Jewish children or probable Jewish children. And at that moment, luckily the German officer involved gave Jan Drobiczynski a choice, and he said, you have until midnight tonight to make these Jewish children disappear. If you don't make these Jewish children disappear, then I will report it and take care of it. And he knew exactly, that was not going to end well for the children. And so at that moment, there was one occasion where for those 33 children, they organized an operation to smuggle those children back into the Warsaw Ghetto. The person that Jan Drobiczynski called and asked to help him at that moment was Janusz Korczak and Stefa. And they said, of course, that they would help smuggle the children back into the Warsaw Ghetto and then would take them at the orphanage. And so they prepared the children, and Jan Drobiczynski remembers the moment. He says, he remembered the moment where they took the children to a hole in the ghetto wall that night. There were always ghetto holes in the wall opening up and closing. Took the children to a hole in the ghetto wall. And he says it was only in the moment that he heard children's voices on the other side of the wall that he understood that Korczak and Stefa had sent other children to help to smuggle the children back through. So that, true to the principles really of Stefa and Korczak, it was a children's operation to come and save fellow children. So those children made it safely back into the ghetto, but they were children that, Irena and her friends had helped wash, right? They'd given them showers and they'd given them clothing. And Irena then began also smuggling into the ghetto at that point dolls, right? And they were dolls that were made by another professor at the Polish Free University who was living in hiding. And he spent the war making dolls with Semitic features because he wanted the children to have dolls that looked like their family. And so one of the things that Irena also risked her life to smuggle back into the ghetto were these dolls that they gave to the 30 children. And of course, the problem for Irena was that not only that day when the children made their walk with Stefa and Janusz to Treblinka, to the Umschlagplatz, the thing that when those children were allowed to choose the belonging that they wanted to carry with them, the children chose those dolls. So she says she remembers standing there, right, watching what she thought of already as her kids, walking to what she understood the Umschlagplatz to be, because by then, by the time of the actions, right, already people had escaped Treblinka. People already had reported back into the resistance networks to anybody who, was very well connected, which she was, and wanted to hear. They already knew what was happening to some extent at Treblinka because there had been some survivors, right? So for Irena, that moment was just this sort of horrifying moment of literally watching what she thought of as her children carrying things that she had smuggled in go to what she understood was their death. That moment is also an amazing part of the story having to do with Alla. Alla, as chief nurse in the Warsaw Ghetto, she that day was also one of the people who witnessed Stefa and Korczak at the Umschlagplatz. She was known as the Good Fairy of the Umschlagplatz. And she and a gentleman named Nachum Remba, who was in the Jewish resistance, in part of the ghetto, Jewish ghetto uprising ultimately, as was Alla. They went to the deportation, to the rail yard, and the Germans were ostensibly reporting that these were just deportations. And so they said, well, okay, we'll play along with your game, and we'll pretend that these are just deportations. They set up a medical clinic, and they said anybody who is ill cannot travel. And so they were able to save the lives of some very, very important people leading the Jewish resistance inside the ghetto. And we're working with somebody whose name you may also have encountered, named Marek Edelman. He was one of the people they worked with that day to save members of the resistance so that the activism could continue. And they were able to save some children, although that was mostly adults that they were able to save that day. And they talk about how in the tents, they broke people's legs because the Germans needed to be persuaded that certain members of the resistance really couldn't travel. And so there were cases where they broke people's bones so that they would legitimately not have an excuse not to travel that day. But Nachum Remba was one of the last people to speak to Korczak. He said that he was one of the ones who, from their clinic tent, saw Korczak and Stefa and the children, and he was the person who tried to intervene and said, please let me try to stop this. The Germans agreed to let Korczak not go to Treblinka if Stefa and the children would go. And that was the moment where Korczak famously said, you don't leave a sick child in the night, and you don't leave kids in a moment like this. And Nachum Remba talks in his memoirs about just collapsing in hysterics, right? Irena that day also she made her way home, and her mother had to call an ambulance, right? Ultimately, Irena Sendler she has a hysterical breakdown that night. She says, that was just the most horrifying thing that she'd ever seen. Ultimately, Alla also had a daughter who was 6 at that time, named Rami. Rami is also one of the child survivors that I spoke to for this book, and one of Irena's children. Rami was 6, 7 around this time. She's her mother made the decision to give Rami to Irena and asked Irena to take Alla and put her in hiding. And so Rami survived the war. She has grandchildren today who are nurses and doctors. But Alla did not survive ultimately. She and Nachum Remba and Nachum Remba's wife, whose name I'm forgetting right now, unfortunately, they fought in the ghetto uprising and were a very, very important part of the resistance. They were arrested. The wife, I can't remember her name, I won't go into the brutality. The wife didn't survive, right? Young women in that moment did not tend to survive to be sent to concentration camps. They were ultimately sent to Poniatowa, which was one of the concentration camps, but not at that point one of the death camps. And they organized a movement trying to break out. They had a plan to try to break out of the concentration camp. Ultimately, the Germans liquidated that camp, and Alla and the other members barricaded themselves in a warehouse, refused to go to line up at the mass graves, and were ultimately burned in the building. So Alla does not survive, but her daughter very much did. And for me, one of the important parts, I think, of Stefa's work and of Janusz's work and Irena's work and Alla's work is the fact that generations are ultimately exponential, right? It doesn't in any way make okay the thing, it doesn't undo the wrongness of it, but the fact that The fact that Rami has a daughter and a granddaughter does mean something about what it meant, ultimately for Irena and Alla and Stefa and Janusz to have done the things that they did. So by the time of the actions, really what happens when the liquidations are, now the roundups are beginning, at this moment, Alla and her friends are just going door to door, right? They go door to door, knock on the doors of strangers and say, look, they're going to come, they're going to liquidate your neighborhood tomorrow. They were able to get information in advance often about where the roundups were going to be. And she would go and she would knock on the doors of strangers and say, will you give me your baby? Right? That was one of the ways that Beata Fikowska was saved, was in those circumstances. And she talks about, she says, often there would be these terrible conflicts in a family where the parents were willing to agree, but the grandparents weren't, and they would say, give us more time and come back tomorrow. And then they would come back the next day and the entire neighborhood was gone. Ultimately, Irena's estimate, we were talking about this earlier, Irena's estimate is that by the end of the war, from the beginning to the end, she and all of the women in this network, right, not Irena alone, she was very, very clear in saying at the end of the war that she made a list of all of the people who helped her, and that list was 14 pages long. She estimated that for every child they were able to save, 10 people in Warsaw had to risk their lives in order to get that child to safety. She says that the estimate is that as many as 2,500 children may have ultimately been saved in this way. So that's really I always want to clarify the part of the 2,500 children saved, because at the moment that's a huge controversy, especially in Poland, about that particular number. Although I think it's a fair point to remember that Irena Sendler is not the only person who did this, that, the stories of people like Alla and Stefa and Janusz and Rachela, who does survive, and Eva, who does not survive, right? All of these, Sophia, who does not survive, right? I mean, all of these women. And it was primarily women, largely because Warsaw during the German occupation, there were not a lot of men, right? I mean, there were older men, there were children, but any man of a military age was not permitted to hang around in Warsaw to foment revolution, right? That was not something that was permitted. So one of the things that, what was I going to say? Lost my train of thought there. Let's see. What's that? I know, it happens to us, especially if you do it without notes, right? Well, anyhow, I've forgotten totally what I was going to say there, but to begin again, so that's the story, right? The main parameter then of the story of Irena Sendler and this group of women involved with that network, right? One of the things, I know what I was going to say, which is why Irena Sendler got so much of the credit, and it's really the fact that two things. One, so many of the women involved did not survive, right? Irena herself said later, the reason that I'm the famous one is I live to be old, and I live to tell the story. And after the Second World War, so when I write her biography, I'd said in the beginning that the Cold War part of that biography remains to be told. I kind of tell the story up to 1945, and at least for Irena, it ends happily in the short term, right? So she survives, Adam survives, they both get divorces, they get married, they have kids, right? I mean, in that limited scope, I mean, a number of the children that she saved became members of their family. Beata Fikowska was with her when she died and thought of her as a second mother. It was another young woman named Teresa who lived with the family for many years. I mean, there's this wonderful story, at least at the end, of how they do make it through and they have a family. Unfortunately, what happens after 1945 is not such a happy story, because for Irena or for any of these activists, because during the Stalinist and then communist period in Poland, you can imagine that the last thing that the Soviets desired was to have activists, well-organized activists who were committed to the Polish state, right? Because throughout all of this, Irena understood her actions to be not only, she understood them to be about social justice and about ethics and about what was correct to do, but she also understood that that was what it meant to be Polish, right? So in her mind, she was absolutely engaged in what she thought of was an act of patriotic Polish resistance as well, right? For her, those were not mutually exclusive ideas, right? And so, and that was really many of the people, not only in her organization, which was later in the war, ultimately became affiliated with an organization known as Żegada, but also for the people who fought in the Home Army, right? So there was this notion that they were fighting for Poland and for the independence of Poland, because it is true that the German program was not only to exterminate the Jewish nation, but also the Polish nation, right? That was also a stated objective. After the Soviet period, though, nobody wanted Polish patriotic activists, and so there were huge roundups. Many of Irena's collaborators were executed in the decade following the war. I don't write a great deal about this in the book, in part because there's only so much a reader can take, right? I mean, right, I've almost got you crying already, right? I mean, like, think if I'd gone on, right? Yeah, you know, ultimately, suffice it to say, Irena at one point is pregnant. She herself is arrested and interrogated by the Soviets for her activism, and is beaten badly enough that she loses the child, right? So, I mean, it would just sort of give you a sense of the kind of danger that Irena herself was in. And so it's one of the reasons why people always say, well, why have the story of Irena Sendler not been told until the 2000s? Like, why all of a sudden after, you know, in the late 90s and in 2000 can we hear the story of Irena Sendler? Why did we never hear these stories before? And the answer is it was simply too dangerous in Poland for anybody to talk about that. That you would not, and Irena's family was in huge danger during that period. Her children were denied educations. There was at least one occasion where one of the children that she saved happened to be married to a senior government official and was able to intervene to stop the execution of an arrest and death warrant for Irena in the post-war period that we know about. So these stories really got buried, right? And hidden, and then it was really only with the end of the Cold War that suddenly the stories began to be told. And I know that when I was in Poland just under a decade ago, I mean, it was probably the first moment that people felt comfortable and safe enough to begin telling those stories again. And my feeling is probably, although Jerry might have a better sense, I think you'll agree, and my sense is that that moment probably has passed again for a generation. That it's the current government in Poland is a very right-wing government, and Irena's story is being manipulated for political reasons that are not ones that she would support. I think we can say that at the moment Irena would not like what's being done to her story, because her story is being used in the contemporary, by the contemporary Polish government. See, we'll get arrested if this video, I'll get arrested now going to Warsaw, won't I? Because Polish people did participate, right? Polish people did participate in anti-Semitic acts against Jewish people in Poland, which is not something that you can freely say at the moment in Poland. And that story is really being recast, right, in a very particular way at the moment, in ways that I'm certain that Irena herself would ultimately not agree with. So chances are we will not find out the stories really about what happened in the Cold War for another, probably it's another 50 or 60 years before we'll hear that. So I think probably I'll stop there. I'm at my 53-minute mark. So I'll stop there. But if you have other questions at all, I'm happy to take. I have 5 minutes for questions. Yeah,
okay.
Is that all right?
It's okay. Yeah.
Any questions or things you'd like to hear more about?
Why is the number that you're going to say is dispute right now?
Yeah, so part of the current political, and Jerry is really in a much better position, but correct me if I've got this wrong, Jerry, but my impression of the situation at the moment in Poland is that, originally Irena's story got picked up in the United States, right, through the Life in the Jar program, and that got pretty readily adopted by a kind of Christian fundamentalist community, is one of the things that happened. with that book and that program, right? So, which isn't anything to do with Irena's story, except that at the end of Irena's life, she becomes a devout reconvert to Catholicism, right? So one of the things that happens is, as a young woman, she leads what is obviously a somewhat bohemian lifestyle. And then, like many of us, she gets older, right? She maybe doesn't want to talk quite so publicly about her bohemian youthful days, especially since they were, she was quite bohemian as a younger woman, right? And so she doesn't want to talk about those. She then ultimately becomes devoutly Catholic after the death of her second child, and in Poland after the war, right? She becomes very, very devoutly Catholic. And is very, very, just very, very passionate about her Catholicism. So one of the things that happened when her story first came out is because there is such a strong Christian element, right, to the way the story was told in the 90s, right, that became aligned, I think just coincidentally, not deliberately in any way, with certain kinds of politics that were more on the right than on the left, right? Which is kind of ironic because Irena's politics early on were very, very far on the left. So one of the kind of pressures on Irena's legacy is this idea of whether she's a saint, right? I mean, I've actually given talks where I've said, that I'm not interested in thinking about Irena as a saint, but in large part because, although I grew up Catholic, I'm not at all religious, and so I don't really believe in saints. So, and I've had people who are Catholic get very, very angry at me at the idea of how do I know she isn't really, truly a saint? I'm like, well, I don't even care. I mean, like, the thing is I just don't care, right? Like, I'm not interested in that part of the story personally. But, so that's on the one hand, right? There's already this kind of Christian overlay. There is a controversy from the period about the fact that the children who were put in the orphanages in order to be hidden, Irena at the time tended to think that it was enough to give them false paperwork. There were a number of people on the Polish Aryan side, right, who believed that those children needed to be actually baptized, right? And that became a huge controversy, and I mean, understandably made the Jewish community furious, right? So there was always this history as well. I think we lost our sound. There was always this history as well of this kind of there's always this kind of Christian fundamentalist push, right? Then what happens in Poland is that a far-right government committed to really a kind of Catholic version of Poland and a kind of retrograde perspective on what it meant to be Polish comes to power, and that was what, 3 or 4 years ago, is that right? So 3 or 4 years ago, Poland makes a very, very hard turn politically to the right. And so now what you have is a Polish government that's deeply invested in the idea that Irena stands for, as she herself, I think, would have agreed, she stands for a certain version of what it means to be Polish. It's just the version that she's standing for at the moment might have been the version at the end of her life that she thought she stood for, but it wasn't really the moment that her actions at the beginning of her life would have represented, right? So what's happened then is that there are a series of very laudatory books about her, and then there has been on the left recently a very controversial and quite celebrated book on the far left, basically talking about the ways in which Irena's story has become exaggerated. So in Poland at the moment, this is a huge controversy, right? But there is, one of the things I say in my biography of Irena is that, I'm not interested in whether she's a saint, right? Because for me, the part that is interesting is that if she's a saint, right, then all of us are off the hook, aren't we? Right? Then we're excused. Because I don't know about you, I'm not a saint. So if only saints have to stand up for social justice and take those kinds of risks in show moral courage in moments of wrongness, then I'm off the hook and probably all of you are off the hook, right?
Then there will be no social
Then
justice.
Exactly.
There are not enough saints.
Because there are not enough saints to exercise social justice in the world. But if Irena Sendler is not a saint, if she is an average, flawed, complicated human being who, faced with a terrible situation, demonstrated what I think is really unspeakable physical and moral courage, and she did it not just once, but she woke up every single day over a period of years and did it. Like when I think to myself in my own kind of private moral reckoning, right, I would like to think that I could have once done that, right? That faced with that situation one day, I think I would like to believe I would have gone into the ghetto and I would have got a kid and I would have done that, right? That I would have been that person. But when I am more honest with myself about would I have woken up every single day and done that, knowing that I was putting my own family at risk of execution by doing that. Like, would I have gotten up every single day and done that over years? Like, I'm less confident of my own goodness, unfortunately, right? I mean, I say that with all humility and, and not any pride in that, but like the amount of physical and moral courage that it took to have done that was really astonishing. And, for me, the more important part of that story is if she was a normal person and she found the courage to do that, then none of us are off the hook, right? And so for me, that's the real problem with that political argument is, it might further certain nationalist or, political ideals, but I'm not sure how it furthers the things that Irena and Korkzak and Stefa would have believed in, which were certain kinds of social, ways of thinking of activism and social justice in a, and I think in a Republican social welfare context. So yeah. One more question, anybody? Yeah, please, yeah,
I
comment.
think it's more like integrity. If you have full integrity, you would go all the way. Like, but there were many resistant people, like Jean Moulin. Jean Moulin went all the way, and he died. But I'm sure that if he was alive now and would ask him, would you do it again, he would do it. And there are people like that. Like, if you have integrity, you keep it and then.
Well, Irena always said afterwards, it's like for Irena, part of the story I didn't tell, she is arrested by the Gestapo at one moment, right? And she talks about the irony of the fact that, so one of the things she did is when she took the children out of the ghetto, she promised the parents that she would write down their real names, right, on a list, which was from, a logistical perspective, an idiot idea, right? Like, that's really dangerous, that's a huge risk, that's not a good idea. But from a human perspective, of course, you have to promise that to parents, right, that you can find your kids again. And so she keeps this list, and she talks about how she's arrested by the Gestapo and she's tortured. She never walks without a limp again, right? She's very, very badly tortured by the Gestapo. She doesn't reveal anything. She's on her way to her execution by firing squad, right? She's lined up on her way out, and as she's on the way, she's pushed by the German officer at the door in the other direction, and she thinks she's going to be interrogated more. She talks about remembering, wishing that she'd had cyanide with her, because thinking, she would have committed suicide in that moment, knowing she believed she was going back into torture, right, and interrogation. And instead, what she later found out is that the Jewish community had paid the biggest bribe that they paid ever during the Polish period to free her. And it wasn't because they loved Irena, although they loved Irena, it was because she had the names of where their kids were, right? And so she talks about the irony, and she says, I thought I was saving the kids with the list, but in the end, right, it was the list of the children that saved her, right? So I always think there's this kind of just, amazing kind of symmetry of the ways in which, sometimes when we think we're saving somebody, we're saving ourselves at the same time, right? There's this really kind of powerful symmetry to that story. But the thing she said later is she said, one, she never stopped having nightmares, right? That to the end of her life, she said, I have nightmares, especially of those moments of asking families to give up their kids, right? Like of those moments. And then she said, the only thing I wish is that we didn't do enough. She's like, I spend time thinking we didn't do enough, right? And it's this kind of, astonishing thing to hear from somebody who lives with the kind of trauma of that for decades. And what she'd said was, not only would I have gone all the way, as you're saying, but that, my regret is that we didn't get everybody, right? I somehow didn't do enough, which of course is a kind of, typical post-traumatic response as well of, thinking somehow in the moment of moral courage, acting in the face of trauma, you don't act correctly, right? I think any psychologist would say that that's a very typical response, but that she lived with that, forever. So I think you're right. I hope, though, would you feel confident that you would do it? I would like to believe I would, but I don't know.
From where I come from, I would.
You would.
I would die to get home.
Well, then we're sticking with you.
You're the one we need to lead the charge for us.